Sarah Mitchell had never considered herself particularly lucky. At 32 years old, she had spent most of her adult life working as an elementary school teacher in a small town in Montana, living a quiet and predictable existence. Her days were filled with lesson plans, parent-teacher conferences, and the occasional weekend hike in the nearby mountains. She wasn't the type of person who sought out adventure or thrills. In fact, most people who knew her would describe her as cautious, methodical, and perhaps a bit reserved. Her relationship with firearms was minimal at best. Growing up in rural Montana meant that guns were simply a part of life, tools that people used for hunting or protection. But Sarah had never developed a passion for shooting. Her father had taught her the basics when she was a teenager, taking her out to an old gravel pit where they'd shoot at tin cans and paper targets. She remembered feeling nervous the first time she held a rifle, the weight of it unfamiliar in her hands, the loud crack of the shot making her flinch. But her father had been patient, showing her how to steady her breathing, how to line up the sights, how to squeeze the trigger gently rather than pulling it. Those lessons had been years ago, though, and Sarah hadn't touched a gun since her father passed away 5 years earlier. The old hunting rifle he'd given her sat in a locked case in her closet, untouched and almost forgotten. She had no interest in hunting, and the thought of target shooting had never really appealed to her. She had other hobbies that suited her personality better, like reading mystery novels, tending to her small vegetable garden, and volunteering at the local animal shelter on weekends. Everything changed on a warm Saturday morning in late September. Sarah had been dating Marcus Chen for about 8 months, and their relationship was progressing nicely. Marcus was a civil engineer who had moved to Montana 2 years earlier for work, and he'd brought with him an enthusiasm for outdoor activities that sometimes pushed Sarah outside her comfort zone. He loved rock climbing, kayaking, and mountain biking. And while Sarah enjoyed these activities in moderation, she appreciated that he never pressured her to be someone she wasn't. When Marcus mentioned that he'd joined the high desert shooting range just outside of town, Sarah had nodded politely but hadn't given it much thought. He explained that he'd developed an interest in long-range precision shooting, a sport that required intense focus, mathematical calculations, and an understanding of ballistics. It wasn't just about pointing a gun and pulling the trigger, he'd told her. It was about reading wind conditions, calculating bullet drop over distance, adjusting for temperature and altitude. It was almost like solving a complex puzzle with every shot. Sarah had listened with mild interest, the way people do when their partners talk about hobbies they don't share. She was happy that Marcus had found something he enjoyed, but she had no intention of joining him. That changed when Marcus mentioned that the range was looking for volunteers to help with maintenance and setup for their upcoming long-range competition. They needed people to help paint targets, set up equipment, and handle various organizational tasks. The range president, a retired Army veteran named Jack Holloway, had put out a call for volunteers, and Marcus thought it might be a nice way for Sarah to see what the sport was about without any pressure to actually shoot. Plus, the range was always looking for members, and volunteering might give her a chance to meet some new people in the community. Sarah, who had been feeling somewhat isolated since her best friend moved away that summer, agreed to help out. On that particular Saturday morning, Sarah arrived at the high desert shooting range with Marcus just after 7 o'clock. The facility was impressive, nothing like the gravel pit where she'd learned to shoot as a teenager. It stretched across several hundred acres of open desert terrain, with shooting positions at various distances and sophisticated equipment that looked like something from a science fiction movie. There were benches with sandbags, spotting scopes on tripods, wind flags dotting the landscape, and massive steel targets set at incredible distances. Jack Holloway greeted them warmly at the main building, a weathered structure that served as both office and clubhouse. He was a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of steady, calm demeanor that suggested he'd seen everything and wasn't easily rattled. He shook Sarah's hand firmly and thanked her for volunteering, then explained what needed to be done. The range was preparing for their annual mile shot competition, an event that attracted precision shooters from across the region. Hitting a target at 1 mile, which translated to 1,760 yards, was considered an impressive feat even for experienced marksmen. It required specialized equipment, perfect conditions, and a deep understanding of external ballistics. Jack explained that only about 30% of competitors typically manage to hit the target at all during the competition, let alone the bullseye. Sarah's job that morning was relatively simple. She needed to go out to the 1-mile line and set up the new steel target plates that had just been delivered. The old targets had been damaged during the last competition, and the new ones needed to be mounted on the existing stands. Jack gave her detailed instructions, showing her photographs of how the targets should be positioned, and providing her with the necessary tools and hardware. Marcus offered to go with her, but Jack asked him to stay behind to help with some electrical work in the main building. Sarah assured them both that she could handle it, grateful for the chance to have some quiet time alone in the desert morning. She loaded the target plates, tools, and hardware into the back of a utility vehicle and began the slow drive across the range to the distant target area. The morning was beautiful, the kind of perfect autumn day that makes Montana famous. The sky was a brilliant blue, completely cloudless, and the air was crisp and cool, with just a hint of sage and dust. As Sarah drove across the desert landscape, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. This was why she loved living in Montana despite the harsh winters and isolation. There was something about the vast open spaces that made her feel both insignificant and deeply connected to the world at the same time. The 1-mile marker was located at the far end of the range, where the desert stretched out endlessly toward distant purple mountains. Sarah parked the utility vehicle and surveyed the area. The target stands were already in place, sturdy metal frameworks that had been engineered to withstand repeated bullet impacts. All she needed to do was bolt the new steel plates onto the frames. She worked methodically, referencing the photographs Jack had given her to ensure everything was positioned correctly. The plates were heavy, about 40 pounds each, and she had to use all her strength to lift them into place. She was grateful for all those weekends of gardening and hiking that had kept her reasonably fit. As she worked, she could hear the distant sounds of shooters at the shorter ranges, the occasional crack of rifle fire carrying across the desert like faint thunder. After about 45 minutes, Sarah had successfully mounted 3 of the 4 target plates. She stood back to admire her work, wiping sweat from her forehead despite the cool morning air. The targets looked good, hanging precisely vertical as Jack had specified. She just had one more to go. As she picked up the 4th and final target plate, she heard the sound of a vehicle approaching. A pickup truck pulled up beside the utility vehicle, and a woman in her 50s climbed out. She introduced herself as Linda Martinez, one of the range's most experienced long-range shooters and the person in charge of organizing the upcoming competition. Linda had brought coffee and donuts for the volunteers, a gesture that Sarah appreciated immensely. They chatted while Sarah mounted the final target plate, with Linda explaining some of the technical aspects of long-range shooting. She talked about how shooters had to account for the Coriolis effect, the rotation of the Earth itself, when shooting at extreme distances. She explained how a tiny error of just a few inches at the shooting line could translate to missing the target completely at a mile away. Sarah found herself genuinely interested, asking questions about the equipment and the mathematics involved. Linda seemed pleased to have such an engaged audience and invited Sarah to stay and watch while she ran some test shots to make sure the new targets were positioned correctly. They would need to verify that the targets were visible from the shooting line and that they could register hits properly. Sarah agreed, curious to see what long-range shooting actually looked like in practice. They drove back to the main shooting line together, Sarah riding along in Linda's truck. When they arrived, Linda led her to one of the shooting benches, where an impressive array of equipment was laid out. There was a massive rifle mounted on a bipod, easily 3 feet long with a scope that looked like a small telescope. Next to it sat a tablet computer displaying ballistics data, a weather station showing wind speed and direction, and various other instruments Sarah didn't recognize. Linda began setting up, consulting the tablet, and making adjustments to the scope. She explained that she was using a custom-built rifle, chambered in 6.5 Creedmoor, a popular caliber for long-range precision shooting. The rifle alone cost more than Sarah's car, not counting the scope and other accessories. Linda loaded a single round into the chamber, settled behind the rifle, and peered through the scope. For several seconds, Linda remained perfectly still, her breathing slow and controlled. Then, with a sudden crack that made Sarah jump despite her ear protection, the rifle fired. Through a spotting scope set up next to the shooting bench, Sarah could barely make out the distant target, looking like a tiny speck on the horizon. After a few seconds, Linda smiled. "Direct hit," she announced. "Dead center. These targets are perfect." She fired 2 more test shots, each one striking the target plate with a distinctive metallic ping that took several seconds to reach them across the mile of distance. Sarah was impressed. It seemed almost impossible that someone could hit such a small target so far away with such consistency. After Linda finished her test shots, she began packing up her equipment. She glanced at Sarah and smiled. "Want to give it a try?" Sarah's immediate instinct was to decline. She hadn't fired a gun in years, and the idea of shooting at such an extreme distance seemed absurd. She wouldn't even know where to begin, but something made her hesitate. Maybe it was the beautiful morning, or the interesting conversation with Linda, or simply a desire to try something completely outside her normal routine. Before she could overthink it, she heard herself say, "Sure, why not?" Linda's eyes lit up with genuine enthusiasm. She quickly began repositioning the rifle, explaining what she was doing as she worked. The ballistic data was already programmed in from her previous shots, so the scope was properly adjusted for the distance. All Sarah would need to do was aim at the target and squeeze the trigger. "Don't worry about hitting it," Linda assured her. "Just getting a shot anywhere close to the target on your first try would be impressive. Most beginners can't even see the target through the scope." Sarah settled into position behind the rifle, trying to remember her father's lessons from so many years ago. The rifle felt different from the hunting rifle she'd used as a teenager. Heavier and more solid, with adjustments and mechanisms she didn't understand. Linda helped her get comfortable, adjusting the height of the sandbags and making sure Sarah's position was stable. Through the scope, Sarah could see the target. A small, dark square against the pale desert background. It looked impossibly far away, shimmering slightly in the morning heat that was just beginning to build. Linda reminded her to breathe slowly, to squeeze the trigger gently, to let her body relax. Sarah's heart was beating fast, a mixture of nervousness and unexpected excitement. She thought about her father, about those afternoons in the gravel pit, about how patient he'd been teaching her something he loved. She took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and allowed her finger to rest lightly on the trigger. The crosshairs in the scope seemed to be dancing slightly, moving in tiny circles as her body swayed almost imperceptibly. She remembered her father telling her to wait for that moment of perfect stillness, that brief pause between heartbeats when everything aligns. She waited, her breathing shallow, her focus narrowing to just the crosshairs and the distant target. Then, without consciously deciding to do so, she felt her finger gently squeeze the trigger. The rifle roared, the recoil pushing back against her shoulder, and for a moment, everything was chaos and noise. Then silence fell again, and Sarah looked up from the scope, her ears ringing despite the hearing protection. Linda had already moved to the spotting scope, searching for any sign of impact in the dirt around the target. Sarah sat back from the rifle, feeling slightly dazed by the experience. Her shoulder throbbed a bit from the recoil, and she could still feel the adrenaline coursing through her system. She expected Linda to tell her that she'd missed completely, that the shot had landed somewhere in the vast expanse of desert between them and the target, but Linda wasn't saying anything. She remained frozen at the spotting scope, one eye pressed to the eyepiece, completely silent. Sarah watched her, puzzled by the lack of response. Had something gone wrong? Had she somehow damaged the equipment or done something dangerous? "Linda?" Sarah ventured carefully. "Did I miss by a lot?" Linda finally pulled back from the spotting scope, but her expression was strange, somewhere between shock and disbelief. She stared at Sarah with an intensity that made the younger woman uncomfortable. Then, without a word, Linda moved back to the spotting scope and looked again, as if needing to confirm what she'd seen. "I need you to look through this," Linda said finally, her voice tight and controlled. "Tell me what you see." Sarah moved to the spotting scope, uncertain what she was supposed to be looking for. She peered through the eyepiece, and there was the distant target, magnified enough that she could see it clearly. The steel plate was rectangular, about 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, painted white with a black bullseye in the center. The bullseye itself was perhaps 12 inches in diameter, A small target at such an incredible distance. I see the target, Sarah said, still confused about what had Linda so unsettled. Look at the bullseye, Linda instructed. The very center. Sarah focused on the black circle. At first, she didn't see anything unusual. Then she noticed it, a bright splash of silver, exactly in the middle of the black bullseye, where the paint had been stripped away by impact. A fresh bullet strike, shining in the morning sun like a beacon. That's where you hit, Linda said quietly. Dead center bullseye. On your first shot. At 1 mile, Sarah pulled back from the spotting scope and looked at Linda. Certain she must have misunderstood. That's not possible, she said simply. I watched the shot through the scope, Linda replied. I saw the impact. That's your shot, Sarah. You just made a perfect 1 mile bullseye on your very first attempt. The two women stared at each other for a long moment. Sarah's mind was racing, trying to process what Linda was telling her. She knew enough about shooting to understand that what Linda was suggesting was virtually impossible. Professional shooters trained for years to consistently hit targets at 1 mile. The idea that someone who hadn't fired a gun in years, someone who'd never even attempted a shot beyond a few hundred yards, could nail a perfect bullseye on their first try was absurd. There must be some mistake, Sarah said. Maybe it was one of your shots? Or someone else's? Linda shook her head firmly. I watched you through the scope the entire time. I saw your shot land. And look. She pointed to the brass casing that had been ejected from the rifle, lying in the dirt beside the shooting bench. That's your spent casing. That was the only shot fired since I finished my test shots. Before Sarah could respond, she heard footsteps approaching rapidly. Marcus was jogging toward them, followed by Jack Holloway and several other shooters who had been working at the range. Word had apparently spread quickly that something unusual had happened. Did you really just hit the mile target? Marcus asked, slightly out of breath. His expression was a mixture of pride and complete bewilderment. We need to verify it, Jack said, his tone professional, but Sarah could see the excitement in his eyes. Linda, you're certain about what you saw? Absolutely certain, Linda confirmed. Perfect center bullseye. I'll stake my reputation on it. Jack nodded thoughtfully, then turned to one of the other men who had gathered around. Dave, can you drive out to the target and photograph it? We need documentation before anyone else shoots. Dave, a younger man in his 30s wearing a range safety officer vest, nodded enthusiastically and headed for one of the utility vehicles. The group stood in awkward silence while they waited, all eyes periodically drifting to Sarah, who felt increasingly uncomfortable with the attention. She still couldn't quite believe what everyone was saying. It had to be a coincidence, or a mistake, or something. The 15 minutes it took Dave to drive out to the target, photograph it, and return felt like an eternity. Sarah found herself fielding questions from the growing crowd of shooters who had gathered, each one more incredulous than the last. How long had she been shooting? What kind of training did she have? What rifle did she normally use? To each question, Sarah could only offer inadequate answers that made the feat seem even more impossible. When Dave finally returned, he was practically running from the parking area, his phone held high like a trophy. You're not going to believe this, he called out. I've got photos and video. The group crowded around as Dave displayed the images on his phone. The first photograph showed the target in full, the white steel plate with the black bullseye clearly visible. But it was the close-up shots that made everyone fall silent. The impact point was dead center in the bullseye. Absolutely perfect. The copper jacket from the bullet had left a bright smear against the steel, and you could see the slight indentation where the projectile had struck. Dave swiped to a video he'd taken. I wanted to measure it exactly, he explained. Using a tape measure, the video showed him measuring from the center of the impact to the edges of the bullseye. The strike was within a quarter inch of the mathematical center. Ladies and gentlemen, Jack announced to the gathered crowd, I think we just witnessed something that might be a world record for a first-time long-range shot. The group erupted in excited chatter. Several people wanted to examine the rifle to make sure it hadn't been modified or had some kind of special advantage. Others wanted to know every detail of Sarah's shooting position and technique. A few skeptics questioned whether this could really have been her first shot at that distance. though Linda and Jack both vouched for her. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention. She'd come to the range that morning expecting to spend a quiet few hours mounting targets and maybe enjoying the peaceful desert morning. Instead, she'd somehow accomplished something that experienced marksmen spent years trying to achieve, and now she was surrounded by strangers who looked at her like she'd performed some kind of miracle. Marcus put a protective arm around her shoulders, sensing her discomfort. "Maybe we should give Sarah some space," he suggested gently. "This is a lot to process." Jack agreed, ushering most of the crowd away and suggesting they continue with their planned activities. But he asked Sarah if she'd be willing to stick around for a bit, explaining that he wanted to have a few other range officials verify what had happened and document everything properly. Over the next hour, Sarah found herself repeating the story multiple times to different people. The range's competition director arrived and interviewed her extensively, taking detailed notes. Several experienced shooters examined the rifle, confirming that while it was an excellent piece of equipment, there was nothing magical about it. Linda's setup had helped, certainly. But the rifle itself didn't account for the impossible accuracy of that single shot. One of the more experienced shooters, a retired Marine sniper named Tom Brennan, offered his professional assessment. "I've been shooting competitively for 30 years, he said, studying the photographs on Dave's phone. "I've made shots at a mile, quite a few of them. But it took me hundreds of attempts before I got my first bullseye at that distance." What Sarah did here is statistically improbable to the point of being almost impossible. The odds of all the variables aligning perfectly on a single shot by someone with minimal experience? I couldn't even calculate it. Could it have been luck? Someone asked. Tom shrugged. Sure, luck played a role. But she still had to have fundamentally sound technique, proper breathing, good trigger control. Even with perfect conditions and the right equipment, if you jerk the trigger or flinch, you'll miss by yards at that distance. She did everything right, probably without even realizing it. As the morning wore on and the initial excitement began to settle, Sarah found herself sitting at one of the picnic tables outside the range office with Marcus, Linda, and Jack. The three of them had become her unlikely allies in processing this strange turn of events. "So what happens now?" Sarah asked, feeling dazed by the entire experience. Jack leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his weathered face. "Well, first thing is, we document everything properly. I've already started writing up a formal report for the range records. We've got photographs, video, and multiple witnesses, including several certified range safety officers and competition judges. This is going in the books as a verified 1-mile bullseye on a first attempt. Then," Linda added with a slight smile, "the shooting community is going to hear about this. Tom Brennan is already talking about posting it on the precision shooting forums. By tomorrow, you're going to be internet famous, at least in our small corner of the world." Sarah felt a flutter of anxiety at that prospect. She'd never sought attention or recognition. The idea of strangers discussing and analyzing her lucky shot made her uncomfortable. "Do we have to share it?" she asked. "Can't it just be a range record or something?" "You could ask people not to post about it," Jack said diplomatically. "But honestly, Sarah, this is the kind of story that's going to get out whether you want it to or not. Too many people witnessed it, and it's too remarkable to keep quiet. My advice? Embrace it. You did something incredible, even if it was mostly luck and good fundamentals. There's no shame in that." Marcus squeezed her hand supportively. "Whatever you decide, I'm proud of you," he said. "Though I have to admit, I'm a little jealous. I've been practicing for 2 years and I've never even hit the 1-mile target, let alone the bullseye." Despite her anxiety, Sarah found herself laughing at that. The absurdity of the entire situation was starting to sink in. She'd accomplished something in one shot that dedicated shooters spent years working toward, and she'd done it almost by accident while helping out as a volunteer. "Can I ask you something?" Linda said, leaning forward with genuine curiosity. "What were you thinking about when you took the shot? Were you trying to remember technique? Or calculating the wind? Or what?" Sarah thought about it carefully, trying to recall those few seconds behind the rifle. "I was thinking about my father," she admitted quietly. He taught me to shoot when I was younger, and he passed away a few years ago. I remembered him telling me to wait for the moment of stillness between heartbeats. So that's what I did. I just waited until everything felt calm. And then I squeezed the trigger. I wasn't really thinking about the distance, or the target, or anything technical. I was just remembering him. The table fell silent for a moment. Linda reached across and patted Sarah's hand. "That's beautiful," she said softly. "Maybe that's the secret. Maybe you weren't overthinking it, like the rest of us do. You just trusted your instincts and let it happen." "Beginner's luck is a real thing," Jack added. "Sometimes, when people don't know enough to be nervous about something, they perform better than they have any right to. We see it in competitions sometimes. A new shooter will come in and have an incredible performance. Then the next time they shoot, they're average because they're thinking too much about it." "So you're saying if I tried again, I'd probably miss?" Sarah asked. "Almost certainly," Tom Brennan said, having walked over to join the conversation. "Which is what makes this shot so special. It was a perfect moment of everything aligning. Good equipment, good conditions, natural talent you didn't know you had, and probably a whole lot of luck. Lightning in a bottle, as they say." As the afternoon sun began to climb higher, the range started to fill with more shooters arriving for their scheduled practice sessions. Word of Sarah's shot had spread, and several people approached the table to congratulate her, or simply to see the person who had made the impossible shot, as it was already being called. Sarah handled the attention with grace. Though Marcus could see she was becoming increasingly uncomfortable, they decided it was time to leave, and Sarah thanked Jack, Linda, and the others for their kindness and patience with her throughout the morning. As they walked to Marcus's truck, Sarah looked back at the range, trying to process everything that had happened. She'd arrived that morning as a volunteer helping to set up targets, with no intention of ever firing a shot. Now she was leaving as the person who had made what several expert marksmen were calling one of the most remarkable shots they'd ever witnessed. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked, as they drove away from the range. Sarah was quiet for a moment before answering. "I think so. It's just strange. This morning I was worried about whether I'd have time to finish grading papers this weekend. Now people are taking my photograph and calling me some kind of shooting prodigy. You don't have to let it change anything if you don't want to," Marcus said. "It can just be a cool story, something that happened one random Saturday morning." But even as he said it, both of them suspected that wasn't true. Sarah had stepped into something unexpected, and whether she liked it or not, that one perfect shot was going to ripple out in ways neither of them could fully anticipate. By Sunday afternoon, Sarah's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Tom Brennan had indeed posted about the shot on several precision shooting forums, and the story had spread like wildfire through the online shooting community. The post included Dave's photographs and video, along with testimony from multiple witnesses. What started as a discussion among shooting enthusiasts quickly jumped to social media platforms, where the story took on a life of its own. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through her phone with a mixture of fascination and horror. Someone had created a Reddit thread titled, "Elementary School Teacher Nails 1-Mile Bullseye on First Shot While Setting Up Targets," that had thousands of upvotes and hundreds of comments. Some people were amazed and congratulatory. Others were skeptical, analyzing the photographs and questioning whether the story could possibly be true. A few were already creating memes about the luckiest shot in history. The local newspaper called Sunday Evening, wanting to do a feature story. Then a reporter from a regional sports network contacted her through the school's website, asking if she'd be willing to do an interview. By Monday morning, when Sarah arrived at Jefferson Elementary School for her regular teaching day, the principal was waiting for her with news that a producer from a national morning show had called. "I told them you'd need to think about it," Principal Anderson said diplomatically, though Sarah could see the excitement in her eyes. "But this is quite remarkable, Sarah. The school is getting calls about it too. Several parents have mentioned it. You're becoming something of a local celebrity." Sarah felt her stomach twist with anxiety. This was exactly what she'd been afraid of. She was a private person who valued her quiet, predictable life. The idea of appearing on national television to talk about a shot that she still believed was mostly luck felt absurd and overwhelming. Her students, however, were thrilled. 7-year-olds didn't care about the technical aspects of precision shooting or the statistical improbability of what she'd done. They just thought it was cool that their teacher had done something special. During morning circle time, Sarah found herself fielding excited questions about whether she was a secret spy, if she'd ever been in the army, and whether she could teach them to shoot. It was just one very lucky shot, Sarah explained patiently. Like when you're playing basketball, and you throw the ball toward the hoop without really looking, and somehow it goes in. It doesn't make you a professional basketball player. It just means you got lucky that one time. One of her students, a serious little girl named Emma, raised her hand. But my dad says you had to do everything right to be that lucky. He says you're probably really good at shooting and just didn't know it. Sarah smiled despite herself. Emma's father was an accountant who had apparently been following the online discussions about her shot. Maybe, she conceded. But I think luck was the biggest part. The week continued in much the same way. Sarah tried to maintain her normal routine, teaching her classes and grading papers, but the attention kept finding her. The local newspaper ran their feature on Wednesday, complete with a photo of Sarah at the range. The article was mostly accurate, though it played up the human interest angle of a quiet teacher accomplishing something extraordinary. Marcus had been supportive throughout, though Sarah could tell he was a bit overwhelmed by the attention as well. Their quiet relationship was suddenly being discussed by strangers online, with some people speculating about whether he'd helped her, or whether this was some kind of publicity stunt for the range. He handled it with good humor, joking that he was now known as the boyfriend of the lady who made the impossible shot. By Friday evening, Sarah was exhausted from the attention and ready for a quiet weekend. She declined several interview requests, including the one from the national morning show, explaining politely that she was just a private person who'd had a lucky moment. She hoped that by refusing to engage with the media circus, the story would die down and she could return to her normal life. Then Jack Holloway called with an unexpected proposition. The High Desert Shooting Range wanted to host a special event in 3 weeks, inviting Sarah to attempt a second shot at the 1-mile target. It would be a fundraiser for a local veterans organization, with sponsors providing donations based on how close she got to her first remarkable shot. There would be media coverage, but it would be controlled and focused on the charitable cause, rather than sensationalizing Sarah personally. I know you're uncomfortable with all the attention, Jack said over the phone. But this is a chance to do something good with it. The Veterans Group helps local former service members with housing assistance and job placement. Every dollar we raise goes directly to helping people who need it. And honestly, you don't have to hit the target at all. Just showing up and taking the shot is enough. People want to see you try, regardless of the outcome. Sarah thought about it for a long moment. She didn't want to appear on television or become some kind of shooting celebrity, but using the attention for a good cause felt different. Her father had been a Marine, and the idea of raising money for veterans appealed to her sense of doing something meaningful. If I agree, Sarah said carefully. Can we keep the media controlled? I don't want a circus. Absolutely, Jack promised. Just one pool camera for documentation, and maybe the local news. No national networks unless you approve them. This is about raising money, not making you famous. Sarah agreed, and immediately felt a flutter of nervousness about the decision. She'd be attempting to repeat something that everyone agreed had been a miracle of luck and timing. The chances of hitting the bullseye again were virtually zero, which meant she'd likely be disappointing all the people who wanted to believe she had some kind of natural gift for shooting. Over the next 3 weeks, the story continued to percolate through shooting communities and local news. The fundraiser event was announced, and within days, several local businesses had signed on as sponsors. The format was simple. Sponsors would donate money based on Sarah's performance. A bullseye would trigger the maximum donations. Hitting anywhere on the target would generate substantial contributions, and even a complete miss would still result in baseline donations from participating sponsors. Linda Martinez called Sarah a few days before the event to offer some advice. Don't practice, she said, which surprised Sarah. I know it seems counterintuitive, But you're not going to become a skilled long-range shooter in 3 weeks. If you practice and struggle, it'll just make you nervous. Trust the same instincts that got you the first shot. Stay relaxed, don't overthink it, and whatever happens, happens. The advice made sense to Sarah, though it meant she spent the days leading up to the event trying not to think too much about shooting at all. She focused on her teaching, on her relationship with Marcus, on the simple routines of her daily life. She reminded herself that this was about raising money for a good cause, not about proving anything to anyone. The morning of the fundraiser event arrived with perfect autumn weather, similar to the conditions during her first shot. Sarah arrived at the range to find it much busier than she'd expected. There were at least 100 people scattered around the facility, including several news crews, photographers, and what appeared to be nearly every serious shooter from a 3-county area. A tent had been set up near the main building with refreshments and fundraising materials. Jack greeted her warmly and introduced her to representatives from the Veterans Organization. They were grateful for the attention and the fundraising opportunity, emphasizing that regardless of how her shot went, the event had already succeeded in raising awareness and generating donations. The actual shooting was scheduled for 10 o'clock, allowing time for the morning wind to settle into its typical patterns. Sarah spent the intervening time chatting nervously with Linda, Marcus, and some of the other shooters she'd met on that first remarkable day. Everyone was supportive, repeatedly telling her that there was no pressure and that simply trying was what mattered. When the time came, Sarah walked to the shooting bench with Linda, who would be operating the spotting scope. The same rifle Sarah had used for her first shot was set up and ready, with the ballistics already calculated for the current conditions. The crowd gathered at a respectful distance, everyone falling silent as Sarah approached the bench. She could feel dozens of pairs of eyes on her as she settled into position behind the rifle. Her heart was pounding, and her hands felt slightly shaky. This was nothing like the relaxed, casual moment of her first shot. This time she was acutely aware of the significance of what she was attempting, of all the people watching, of the money riding on her performance. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment and took several deep breaths, trying to recapture that sense of calm she'd felt during her first shot. She thought about her father again, about those afternoons in the gravel pit, about his patient voice telling her to wait for the moment of stillness. She reminded herself that this shot didn't define her, that missing wouldn't diminish what she'd accomplished before, that the real victory was already won in the money raised and awareness generated. When she opened her eyes and looked through the scope, the target seemed to shimmer in the distance, a small rectangle of white steel against the tan desert. She could see the marks from her first shot, the bright splash of copper still visible at the center of the bullseye. It looked impossibly far away, impossibly small. Sarah settled into the shooting position, feeling the rifle settle against her shoulder. She began to breathe slowly, counting the breaths the way her father had taught her. 1 breath, 2 breaths, 3 breaths. She felt her heartbeat steady, her hands growing calmer. She focused on the crosshairs, watching them dance slightly across the face of the target. For a moment, the crowd, the cameras, the fundraiser, all faded away. It was just Sarah, the rifle, and that distant target. She waited, breathing slowly, letting her body settle into the position. Then, just as before, she felt that moment of perfect stillness, that brief instant between heartbeats when everything aligned. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed across the desert. The recoil pushed back against her shoulder as the crowd held its collective breath, everyone's eyes turning to Linda at the spotting scope. Several seconds passed, the time it took for the bullet to travel the mile distance and for the sound to return. Then they heard it. The distinctive metallic ping of copper striking steel, clear and unmistakable across the quiet morning air. "She hit it," someone shouted, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Sarah pulled back from the rifle, her hands shaking now from the adrenaline. Linda was already examining the impact through the spotting scope, and her expression was a mixture of amazement and disbelief. "Where?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible over the celebrating crowd. Linda pulled back from the scope and looked at Sarah with wide eyes. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "It's not a bullseye, but it's close. Really close. Maybe 6 inches from center." Saver. Working where? The Saver Sensei. The next to do it, remember. The Saver Sen. The next to do it. 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 The crowd's reaction intensified as word spread. While it wasn't the perfect center shot Sarah had made the first time, hitting that close to the bullseye on only her second attempt at long-range shooting was still remarkable. The event organizers quickly announced that the shot was more than close enough to trigger the maximum sponsorship donations. As Dave once again drove out to photograph the target, Sarah found herself surrounded by well-wishers and congratulatory handshakes. This time, though, she felt different about the attention. She wasn't embarrassed or overwhelmed. Instead, she felt a quiet sense of pride. She hadn't repeated her miracle shot, which somehow made this feel more real and earned. When the photographs came back showing her second shot, just 6 inches from her first, the crowd's enthusiasm reached a new level. Tom Brennan, the retired Marine sniper, addressed the gathered shooters with obvious emotion in his voice. "I've been in this sport for decades," he said. "And what we just witnessed is remarkable. Not just one lucky shot, but 2 excellent shots by someone with minimal training. Sarah might have stumbled into this almost by accident, but she clearly has natural ability. More importantly, she's used the attention from her first shot to raise thousands of dollars for veterans. That's the real story here." The fundraiser ended up generating nearly $15,000 for the Veterans Organization, far exceeding everyone's expectations. Local businesses had been generous, and even some of the shooting equipment companies who'd heard about the event had contributed. The Veterans Group representative gave a short speech thanking Sarah and the range for making the event possible. As the crowd began to disperse and the cleanup began, Sarah sat at one of the picnic tables with Marcus, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. The past few weeks had been chaotic and overwhelming, but somehow she'd navigated through them and ended up here, having helped raise money for a cause that mattered to her. "So," Marcus said with a smile, "what now? Are you going to take up competitive shooting? Linda's already offered to coach you." Sarah laughed and shook her head. "I think I'm done with long-range shooting for a while. I got lucky twice, and I don't want to push it. Besides, I like teaching. I like my quiet life. This was amazing and strange and wonderful, but it's not who I am." "That's fair," Marcus agreed. "Though you have to admit, you're pretty good at something you claimed you had no interest in." "Maybe," Sarah conceded. "Or maybe I just have really good timing for miraculous luck." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the desert landscape stretch out toward the distant mountains. Sarah thought about her father, wishing he could have seen what she'd accomplished. She liked to think he would have been proud, not just of the shots themselves, but of the way she'd handled the unexpected attention and used it for something good. Later that evening, after declining several more interview requests and thanking what felt like hundreds of people for their congratulations, Sarah finally made it home. She changed into comfortable clothes, made herself a cup of tea, and settled onto her couch with a book she'd been meaning to read for weeks. Her phone buzzed with another notification, probably someone else wanting to talk about her shots or schedule an interview. She glanced at it briefly, saw it was another media request, and set the phone aside without responding. Tomorrow she'd go back to being a regular elementary school teacher, grading papers and planning lessons and tending her garden. But tonight, she allowed herself to feel proud of what she'd done. Not just the remarkable shots, though those were certainly something special, but more importantly, she'd faced something completely outside her comfort zone, handled attention and pressure she'd never sought, and managed to turn an accidental moment of excellence into something that helped others. As she opened her book and took a sip of tea, Sarah smiled to herself. Life had a funny way of taking you places you never expected to go. A few weeks ago, she'd been worried about having time to grade papers. Now she was the person who'd made 2 nearly impossible shots and raised thousands of dollars for veterans, all because she'd volunteered to help set up targets on a quiet Saturday morning. She thought about what one of the reporters had asked her earlier that day. Did she believe in fate or destiny? At the time, she'd given a diplomatic non-answer, but sitting there in her quiet house, Reflecting on everything that had happened, Sarah decided that maybe she did believe in something. Not destiny exactly, but maybe moments of possibility. Moments when you're presented with an unexpected opportunity and you have to decide whether to step forward or step back. She'd stepped forward, however reluctantly, and somehow it had worked out beautifully. The story would become part of the range's history, a tale told to new shooters about the volunteer who made an impossible shot. The money raised would help veterans in her community, and Sarah herself had learned something about her own capabilities, about being willing to try things outside her comfort zone. Her phone buzzed again, and this time Sarah picked it up. It was a text from Linda. "Serious offer still stands if you ever want to learn more about long-range shooting. No pressure, but I think you'd be good at it if you wanted to pursue it. Either way, thank you for today. You made something special happen." Sarah smiled and typed back a simple response. "Maybe someday. For now, I'm happy being a teacher who once got really, really lucky. Thank you for everything." She set the phone down and returned to her book, ready to let the world move on to its next story while she returned to her normal, quiet, beautiful life. But every now and then, when she passed the locked case in her closet that held her father's old hunting rifle, she'd pause and remember. Remember that sometimes the most extraordinary moments happen when you least expect them, and that luck favors not just the prepared, but also the willing. Years later, when students or neighbors would ask her about the famous shots, Sarah would smile and tell them the truth. It was mostly luck, decent fundamentals she'd learned from her father, and a willingness to try something that seemed impossible. She never became a competitive shooter or a gun enthusiast. She remained what she'd always been, a dedicated teacher with a love for quiet mornings and simple pleasures. But she also became something else, though she rarely thought about it this way. She became proof that ordinary people can have extraordinary moments, that unexpected talent can emerge in the most unlikely circumstances, and that sometimes the best response to sudden fame is grace, humility, and a quick return to the life you love. The targets at the high desert shooting range still bear the marks of her two remarkable shots, preserved as a reminder of the day an elementary school teacher accomplished something that seasoned marksmen spend lifetimes working toward. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when the desert air is crisp and clear, shooters at the range will pause at the 1-mile line and remember the story of Sarah Mitchell, who came to set up targets and ended up making history instead.